Professor Wole Soyinka, distinguished guests and members of the AHP family, I hail you all in your different capacities. When in my Sunday school days, our teacher taught us about John the Baptist, a voice calling out in the wilderness saying, "After me comes one more powerful than I, the straps of whose sandals I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie." Though very fascinated by the figure of John the Baptist, I never ever dreamed that I would one day stand in his very shoes, but here I am. And Professor Soyinka, as the wild Christian would perhaps tell me, itirai ningongongonkan. I'm sorry, I was trying to speak Yoruba. What it means is trying is everything. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a student of literature, a subject where cliches are ubiquitous, but because they keep coming again and again, I will use some. The subject of my presentation this evening needs no introduction. In Uganda, the nation of my origin, he is literally a household name. In the literary corridors where I have spent most of my life, he's our staple food. Even my current students, God bless them, who exasperate me sometimes because of how little they care to know this one name. Know it so well that when you say WS, they know one WS. My poetry class were the first to tell me about the famous Wole exit and the fact that Professor Soyinka planned to go back home where, according to him, he should never have left. This is the life story of the first African to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. A man who understands the very core of the humanities as a reflection on how to live, on how to be a human being, on how to live with clarity, dignity, and insight, and not to be afraid of standing out and standing apart as a voice of conscience. A man who knows the significance of personal freedom, or as he once put it, of delivering himself from uncertainty, from discomfort, from internal turmoil. I present to you this evening a man whose very DNA refuses dictators, both physically and in the mind. As all who have read Ake, The Years of Childhood, and who are familiar with his aunt, Fumilayo Ransom Kuti, the woman who was never afraid of pulling down strongholds of oppression, I want to gather. I'm proud to say he's one of the most prominent voices to have immortalized protest against Uganda's Idi Amin Dada in his play, A Play of Giants. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the public intellectual who enrages dictators so much that one of them pronounced a death sentence in absentia on him. As Professor Soyinka himself puts it in his second autobiography, he sets forth at dawn. He remains the linchpin in African literature and philosophy, and as many literary critics have observed, it will take time to fully grasp his deep response to people, cultures, and events. He is the African writer that every other African writer and literary critic has to come to terms with. In short, Professor Wole Soyinka is an institution. In these few minutes, I present to you an extraordinary storyteller, a connoisseur of language, an incredibly courageous voice for human rights, a symbol of a free Nigeria and a liberated Africa. An epic tale for the quest of democracy, home and abroad. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to the rare privilege of being part of Wole Soyinka's legacy, that of a man thinking. And Professor Wole Soyinka, you who is no stranger to stages and intellectual platforms, this platform awaits you.
Mr. Chairman, my dear friends, colleagues, compatriots, Africanists, humanists, etc., etc. This stool here is itself a bit of a conundrum. I requested it specially because I have a problem with my right knee, which has been aggravated by a disease known as ageism. Because by now it should have healed, but hasn't. So to be on the safe side, I requested a prop, a stage prop. In this case, a very useful one. And I wanted something with which I was familiar, with which I'm at home. So I told them I want a bar stool. I'm sorry that I appear to have given so much problem because some people had never heard of a bar stool. But surely you heard about propping up the bar, you know, which is one of our favorite occupations. And so I apologize in advance, but I thank you for providing something. And I will ask your permission to please use it while addressing you, having proven to you that I can stand if I actually choose. Yes, that's better. So now, it's been a very difficult to decide on a topic, and I've changed the title so often. But I think the last thing I scribbled here as the most appropriate is lost history, found revisionism. Lost history, found revisionism. So it's a lost and found story, and then you can count which are the pluses and minuses. But first, let me welcome you. I know you've been welcomed since you came for this event by several people, but I'm going to give you a very special welcome to situate you correctly. So now I'm welcoming you, a very special welcome, to perhaps the only nation in the world that has formally abjured the notion of history as a notable plinth of African humanities, or indeed as deserving of a place in its own right as an intellectual asset for the nurturing of the human mind. It would appear that we are embarrassed in this country by the sheer prospect of conceptualizing our existence within a historic framework. It's a strange feeling to discover that, unbeknown to many of us, we have been conscripted into a voyage of human reorientation whose end in view is nothing less than the abolition of history. This has nothing to do with the contested thesis of Francis Fukuyama, which he at least gave us something to chew over in his short-lived exposition. The Last Man, the End of History, and The Last Man. I think that's the full title, The End of History and The Last Man. Just to give us something to chew over in his thesis, which is also something which has undergone quite a few self-revisions in his own exposition. The most recent, I think, took place in the New York Review of Books. That is the one which I saw sometime last year, but I think it was even older than that, in which he revised his notion of humanity having come to the end of history. In our own case, however, we are confronted with an end in the most savage, abrupt, literal, and definitive manner. A shortcut that anticipated and foreclosed debate in the simple, self-effacing language of annulment through abandonment. It reminds me very much of the pronouncement of a former American president who, when he was asked what was his policy towards the African continent, replied, "A policy of benign neglect." That translates as, act as if Africa does not exist. What happened here, however, in this country, was a little more proactive. Simply stop teaching the damned thing. No more history. African humanities redefined through truncation. It's very curious, how humanity, sections of it anyway, from time to time, periodically, they feel a need to pronounce the end of what is such an obvious, even instinctive product of human existential activism. I do not claim for a moment that it is humanity's purpose. I'm referring to history. No, I'm not saying that it's raison d'etre, its very fundamental reason for being. No, I simply refer to that basically non-palpable product that derives from human activities for reproducing, transforming, and ensuring the continuity of the species, history. Of course, it all depends on how we view history. Some of us see it as a dynamic, constantly in the making. Others, however, view history as a narrative towards which, Yes, others view it as a narrative towards whose predetermined conclusion or fulfillment humanity itself came to be. This is another way of reading history as purpose-generated, usually captured in the word teleology. If I were to propose, for instance, that Francis Fukuyama and the Algerian Islamic Front, FIS, of the 1990s have a lot in common, you might raise an eyebrow, but they do. Both meet on one common ground, the teleological. On evidently coasting to victory in elections in the 1990s, the FIS declaration was pure Fukuyama, but also its perversion. We ascended to power through the liberal democratic process, but that goal achieved, liberal democracy itself has become an anachronism. No, worse, even a blasphemy. The goal of history has been achieved, and thus all oppositional alternative constructs, including even their innate contradictions, the very material processes that propel history towards its destined goal, have been rendered superfluous and obsolete. We have arrived, they claimed, at the end of history. The case of Nigeria was, of course, somewhat different. Indeed, there was no such overt declaration, no hint of a deductive process, however arguable. Mind you, the indicatives were already present. Those details may be entertaining, but they're not really relevant here. But if I may quickly remind you, that pronouncement, that abolition of history was made during the period when 5 political parties very generously decided to dissolve themselves into only one, which was, of course, destined to be the life governance of this nation. I think one of our most voluble politicians at the time, the late Bola Ige, referred those political parties as the 5 fingers of one leprous hand. Now, was it just a coincidence that they dissolved themselves, merged themselves into just one, just around the same time that history was being abolished as a subject here? It seemed to me to have been more than a coincidence that the governing body at the time, that regime, did feel like the FIS that Nigeria had arrived at the end of history. And so, what was the point again of elections? What was the point of political parties? History had come to an end. The last man standing had in fact been abolished. Now, the theories about history, for instance, we agree, and this is one example, one supporting incident. We agree that humanities are generally Eurocentric, even more Eurocentric in terms of history than we find in sociology. The theories about literature, the humanities, even philosophy, very often derive from the European framework. You may call this kind of attitude the intellectual complement to that American president's policy of benign neglect. In other words, intellection itself has conducted a policy, a proceeding of benign neglect of the African continent. History repeats itself as an exception, for instance, applies not only temporally, in other words, in time, but also spatially. This fact, this truism, unfortunately, has been lost on much of European intellection in the humanities. It could mean, of course, this means, of course, that events, even of near identicality, may have taken place on the other side of the globe, even simultaneously. But when this happens, are they necessarily connected? European assessment appears not to think so. But the answer is yes, possibly yes, but then just as likely not. What happens in Georgia or Romania may be a mere replication of what once took place in Central African Republic, but with vastly different causalities, including the cultural, and of course, the different consequences and eventual forms of resolution. Emperor Bokassa may have crowned himself in the Napoleonic mode, but he was no Napoleon, nor did the historical factors that led to the coronation of Napoleon are exactly the same as what led Bokassa to this imperial mimicry of Napoleon Bonaparte. But he did carry out all the rituals, the procedure. I believe he even imported the horses and carriage and had the costumes made in France in the Napoleonic style. But no, Central African Republic was no Napoleonic empire, and so on and so forth. And one of the functions of the European humanities, whether we're talking about history, sociology, and of course, obviously, languages and consequently literature and culture, and of course philosophy, the themes there, because of the proceeding that led us to wherever we are at any given moment, are vastly different. And so many of these theories have to be re-examined on the terms of our own experience and, of course, contemporary development. Now, depending again on degrees of consciousness, the self-inflicted amputation may count as a somewhat disturbing act on the one hand, because among the sobering reflections when a nation, a people abolish history, among the sobering reflections is that it attracts the possibility that perhaps, after all, Hegel was right, that Africans are indeed a people outside history, that we entered history only with the incursion of the European world into the continent, including the enslavement of our own race. This is when we became significant as historical creations. Let us recall that even some Marxist historicist schools, I recall in particular Raymond Williams, the Oxford Marxist historian, as such notorious expositors who constantly raise my hackles on this issue. Africa was seized upon by this school simply as an anthropological resource reference. So how could it possibly fit into, for instance, a Marxist straitjacket of historical formulation? So that school of racial designation simply ruled the continent as being outside any rational seizure of history. Mind you, I always try to look on the bright side of things, and so perhaps did that dictatorship, that military dictatorship, when it chose to abolish history. Because by so doing, he was probably throwing Nigerians a challenge. Offered as a new sprung entity with no prior debilitating baggage, we become that rarity that comes into being as a tabula rasa, a clean slate on which we can then proceed to inscribe a unique, unprecedented narrative of our own. That's one way of looking at it. I find the idea rather fascinating, to be without history, to start all over again, born again humanity. And without question, of course, and you're free to ask any Nigerian today, the leader of that regime, by name Sani Abacha, did make history, especially the history of grand larceny, which continues to make history, continues to make history years after his departure, even till today, as recently as in the media just a few days ago. Of course, there are one or two drawbacks attached to such a truncation. One cannot deny that. But they're minor, in my view. One is just a quick overview. The intellectual formulation of young minds, deprived of the excess baggage of history. So they go to school light-hearted, lightweight, no baggage whatever, go into the world without any excess baggage. Quite apart from the acquisition of knowledge as a potentially transformative end in its own right, these are minds, however, that are presumably being groomed for possible responsibilities that do not exclude guiding their nation or influencing policies at various tiers of governance and producing, sometime in the future, the policies that actually develop a nation. They may end up with responsibilities that involve interaction with other nations, both distant and contiguous on every level. This can range from negotiating trade agreements, peacekeeping, food security, cultural exchanges, to even simple tourism. All this would be undertaken on behalf of their nation without a basic knowledge of who they were, how they came to be, the constitutive processes that resulted in their being citizens of one nation rather than another, or indeed how they fitted into the global network that has defined and circumscribed human groupings since the emergence of the species. These are some of the very minor, negligible disadvantages, of course. There will also be the problem for us, professionals, of disposal. Even garbage takes up space and does not remain completely inert, even though regarded as discard. Once produced, even garbage manifests, albeit in a different form, some kind of activity, some resulting in energy, which may prove combustible. This is one of the problems of discarding history. Refer to the ongoing experiments by those scientific geniuses, for instance, who proceed today to produce energy from what we consider as waste. So even if history is waste, there's one good reason not to ignore that waste, because it may turn combustible when no one is looking. There is the vast legacy, therefore, of historians to look at, involving a long line in the tradition of griot and epic narrators, living and dead, with their progenies, including both the native archivists and visiting itinerant historians. One's mind readily goes to scholars such as Carnegie, Jacob Ajay, Shekanta Diop, Valentin Mudimbe, Mazizi Kunene, Amadou Hampate Ba, Tenene Tamuno, and others. Or earlier, Samuel Johnson, and even the industry of amateur historians such as religious interlopers of all faiths. We should not fail even also to involve scholars of even more ancient pedigree, such as the 14th century Moroccan Berber, Ibn Battuta. Now, that compulsive wanderer may not have physically crossed the border of the nation space now known today as Nigeria, but he did come close, having visited and sojourned in Mali and explored the famous domain of learning in Timbuktu. Ibn Battuta is even credited with taking 2 pygmies back with him on his return to Morocco as curios. Distasteful though that might be, it is evidence that in addition to his incursions along the Swahili coast, he did penetrate through to the Bantu forested regions of the continent, and so on and on. The provocation of this being that even if we choose to deny ourselves a history, others have taken the trouble to fill in that lacuna, providing narratives that enable us to critique the narratives of others, including ours, such as Battuti's predecessor, the Greek Herodotus, in whose works Africa features quite prominently, his compilation, which of course has been a mixture, a very heady mix of mythology, hearsay, which however became a source for European historicism through the Middle Ages, constituting hell's bestiary. And of course, if you want to actually historicize hell, what better place to put it than within the African continent? And so all the way through medieval, Elizabethan, Victoria, through even the Age of Enlightenment in Europe, we received the demonized historicism of exterior forces, interests. We have no choice today but to take notice. Now, don't ask me what we were all doing in this afflicted nation when this thing happened to us and history was abolished. I can make my personal excuses and say that I was in exile at the time. Remember, I took sabbatical leave under Sani Abacha, so I can claim that I wasn't around at the time. But I did come back, and it still took me another 10 years before I became aware that my history, any history, had been abolished. But let us not dirge for too long over the sporadic accumulation of the encountered symptoms that led eventually to an awareness of that yawning lacuna, beyond stressing that there had been a generalized, vague consciousness. I speak for myself and from some of my close colleagues that something was missing in the formulation of young minds, of new students, new generation students. We met, we spoke about it, and we knew that there was a kind of decontextualization of experience, of even the processing of information, a lack of a base which we could not quite identify. But eventually, of course, we recognized that it was simply a lack of historical foundation. And even successive governments have recognized that lack. Even this present government, a few years ago, did lament and condemn the elision of history in our humanities. That was about 2 or 3 years ago, and I think that pronouncement is also passing into history. All I ask is that nobody should come and complain to me if UNESCO, having finished its historical series, the Silk Route, the Slave Route, the Iron Route, now moves on to a route which has become one of the most pressing issues of our time, and that is the migration routes. In fact, the entire history of migrations, one that has become to accuse Africa as a nation, since Africa today supplies the largest percentage on the globe of migration. And yet we know that migration is a human phenomenon, one that has existed and in fact constitutes the very nature of Homo erectus since the beginning of time. Migration, that phenomenon resounds from center stage as the closing dirge of the last century, and in fact the signature tune of the current. It deeply concerns our continent, and certainly concerns that nation, this nation. What issue other than migration has leapt to greater prominence in our daily existence today in this country as a common factor in the, well, let's begin from outside. Even if we look over our borders, what other factor can be proven to be a common factor in the eruption of ultranationalism as embodied, for instance, in the likes of Donald Trump, or the Forza Italia, or Francis Le Pen, Brexit and its triumphalist facilitator, that second-hand Winston Churchill in the person of Boris Johnson, or even turning inwards with great embarrassment into the continent itself. How else attempt to situate the virulent xenophobic outbreak in a supposed sister nation such as South Africa if we lack a grounding in our own history? And we dare not evade homing even closer inwards into our own existence in this nation, and with even greater pertinence and immediacy to our situation, the Nigerian arena. Internally, we're being painfully instructed that if we do not take control of our own history, our own historic realities, and be instructed thereby, others may include others, and I include internal imperators with the will to eradicate our history, will definitely triumph and predominate. Let us take, as a current instance, a notorious corruption of history in the promotion of an agenda of ethnic cleansing. I use that expression deliberately. No other expression for me can serve. Not far from this spot, after the brutal overrunning of thriving communities and indiscriminate slaughter of their indigents in figures that were already running into hundreds, the nation virtually deafened by the outcry of the bereaved, the mangled and mutilated, the government of one of the most affected states, forced to take measures to safeguard its peoples, proceeded to enact a law that sought to curb the extremist activities of some of those very migrants. That they happened to be cattlemen is of interest only because they were herders of an ancient nomadic tradition, that is, seasonal migrants, but with a capacity for destruction through their commodity, herds of cattle. Does anyone need reminding of the response from the leadership of these latter-day cattle colonizers known as Maeti Allah? No prize for guessing. A recourse to history to justify serial brigandage and massacres. Our ancestors, the spokesman claimed, once ruled these parts of the state and beyond, and were thus historically entitled to reclaim those lands any time of their own choosing. That was a public statement. True or false? Should it matter? We're concerned with a cynical, anti-humanist recourse to history as justification for modern-day inhumanity. The theme of migrations just happens to be one of the most pressing issues that confront the world today, not just Nigeria. And the question is how to seize hold of a comprehensive unfolding of the various dynamics of human dispersals and convergences that are forerunners of current conflicts, some exploding in regional wars, including liberation struggles. Apartheid, Matasini, Boko Haram, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, ISWAP, and the imperial obscenities that have characterized the utterances of groupings like Maeti Allah, even in this second decade of the 21st century, and within a nation that claims to continue to nibble at the edges of modernity. We can indulge ourselves with notions of history as being linear or cyclic, for all they care. For such aggressors, history is having your cake, yet eating it, since it is wrapped in a paradoxical condition, being both static and propulsive. Here is the thesis, theirs, not mine. I merely attempt to explain what may lie in the heads of the spokesmen of such groupings when they invoke history to justify dehumanization. History has a predetermined end, is what perhaps runs in their mind. However, for reasons which they do not bother to explain to the rest of us, history does get edged away from time to time from that fixed track that was specially ordained towards the location of fulfillment. Maybe these histories' procurators were grazing their cattle in some newly declared green belt. We don't know. But the justification for human existence, in their view, is to take history back to that moment and place of derailment. And if that requires the elimination of thousands of humanity and the incineration of hundreds or more socialized settlements just to get back on that cyclic rut, so be it. Everything justifies the convenient evocation of a past, no matter how fleeting and fragmentary, no matter how real or concocted. Our response and the justification for an African humanities is, I propose, to interrogate all such claims, both as a duty to knowledge and truth, however remote those events are. We then update our analysis of such claims through contemporary experience and human discoveries. This, after all, is the age of space travel and even possible galactic migrations. And so we have a responsibility to examine that evoked past, its contributions and relevance to present social conditioning. In this case, we begin by immersing ourselves not just in the history, but in the sociology of migrations. In short, we ensure a holistic approach to migration, including nomadic culture. Again, as a feature of human convergence and displacement. And the questions that then arise are such as what has changed between the features and patterns of migration between one century and another, or between 2 decades, such as between 2010 and 2020. Why and how are the history and pattern of migrations different between the world of immediate post-World War II and the age of ISIS and Boko Haram? How does migration in the Sahelian region differ from the migratory pattern along the Swahili coast? Do religious factors come in anywhere at all? Or is this a contrived factor? What of the religious faith in arms, such as the mandate of AK-47s, in contrast to cattle prods for control, the stick and the knife of just a decade or 2 ago? We're speaking here of a holistic approach to history and indeed geography. We shall come briefly to that later in a moment. What we need to stress at this stage is simply this: we can hardly begin to attempt any remedial exercise in social dysfunction, either internally or globally, continental, if we turn off the faucets from the fountainheads of the past, however muddied the ensuing waters have turned across the degraded terrain of human interaction. Otherwise, any toppenny homicidal demagogue can arise from nowhere, and just like the external European imperators of our past, resume the task of revisionism in the interest of alien imperious interest. The Yoruba proverb sums it up very simply: if we do not know where we're headed, let us at least seize upon where we set off. History, of course, is only one item of the tree, one limb of the tree of the humanities. It just happens to be the one that agitates some of us in this part of the world at this particular time, these dire times we live in. Those who wish can debate its hierarchical importance. That, for me, would be a futile exercise. It's sufficient to assert its place, among other pursuits, as an intellectual formative discipline of enormous consequence for society. And so this makes the question purely rhetorical, whether or not we have a right to forgo any of these critical branches of the humanistic tree, or consider a rounded formation preferable to the partial, and whether the vagaries of political circumstances at any time should be permitted to establish a mentality of half a loaf is better than none. So let us diverge a little from that lost in transit discipline called history, just to ensure that we do not place all the burden of relevance on only one branch in the tree. I still vividly recall, just to lighten our discourse a little, I recall my horror over half a century ago of my very first lecture visit to the United States. I must have presented quite a picture of primitivism with my reaction when I discovered that geography was not being taught in American schools. I checked and rechecked. No, indeed, there was no such subject as geography. What appeared to stand in for geography was knowledge. No, more accurately, memorization of a full list of the 48 or 49 states of the United States. I forget how many now. To be able to recite them and their capitals, that was the sum of geography in those days. I haven't asked. I don't know whether it has changed since. I've protested everywhere, but I don't think anybody listens to me. And that constituted, at the time, the summation of geography. Do I exaggerate? That's possible, but I taught in many schools during that period. I tried hard when I encountered this phenomenon to recapture my passage through school, as we were taken through the infinite variety of the sheer physicality of human existence, and with such exciting variations, including such incidentals as climate, geoclimate. The rewards would follow years later in a sequence of recognitions as I plunged into one alien territory after another. Then the cultural correlations, aligning the geography of settled spaces with cultural formative factors of any peoples, and then, of course, the shaping of their history itself. Yes, once again, history, always omnipresent, interwoven, lurking in the background, bursting through to the surface in spasms of illumination, or sometimes rebuke. But it was the geography of Southern Africa, for instance, that commenced the centuries-long Boer trek into the racist ideology of apartheid. It was the geography. The Boers came, they saw, and salivated. That geographical expression, the land of milk and honey, never mind its biblical association, has generated more hostilities across the histories of continents than any other expression I can think of anyway. Never mind if today milk and honey translates into mineral resources, from gold to petroleum, and sometimes even tourism. On a personal level, however, whenever it came to travel, I did not rely on any weather forecast to make me keep as far away as possible from North Central America in winter. In any case, weather forecast during that period was still at the level of crystal gazing. 9 times out of 10, they were wrong. However, I already knew in advance of the punishing winds across the Great Lakes, just as the severity of the tundra landscape in Canada constituted no surprise and laid the foundation for my expanding geography of cowardly avoidance. More poignantly, however, especially within the Americas, both North and South, and the Caribbean, a geography cum historic consciousness influenced my early destination priorities whenever I had a choice. Priority was generated by sense of identity. In short, mostly questions about what happened to in the intervening years to those who were forcibly removed from these shores. Mississippi River, yes, indeed. This was part of my geography, as closely internalized as, for instance, the Nile, the Niger, or the Sahara Desert. That river, the Mississippi, conveyed much closer emotions than even the Atlantic Ocean, an inundation of the pain and anguish of severance and inhuman bondage. The Atlantic and the Sahara, these were indeed the conveyor belts. But the southern zone of America, threaded by the Mississippi, that, for me, was the locality of living death, the terminus of one history that began on a continent. The totality of such embedded knowledge enabled a greater appreciation, not merely of the slave trade as an integral part of my own history, but of such cultures as survived the uprooting of millions of black humanity, the transportation into alien territories, the strategies for survival, and the narrative of their resistance. The integrality of geography to culture and history in the quest for human identity is perhaps best summed up in a personal narrative of the universality of human resistance and resilience, one that I touched upon in my memoirs, You Must Set Forth at Dawn, a clear instance of geography at play in the fortunes of my natal town, Abuja, beyond the Atlantic, in faraway Kingston, Jamaica. I'll summarize it very quickly, that many of you may have read it, but it was indeed in the Americas, in the Caribbean, I beg your pardon, that I discovered Abuja, which I always thought was just about an hour's flight from here. However, in Westmoreland County, Jamaica, there I encountered Jamaica, Abuja of Egbaland. Now, we all know the history of slavery. We know it is littered with narratives of resistance. Who hasn't learned, who hasn't heard of heroes of resistance, King Christophe, Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines and company, and many others? A history that has inspired other tributaries of the humanities, music, theater especially, including the poetic tragic drama King Christophe by Mrs. And before him, Eugene O'Neill's Emperor Jones, that took his inspiration from, in fact, the saga of King Christophe. Even that saga drew a small contribution from this very speaker in the form of a small poem when I first visited his citadel, Sans Souci, in Haiti. It's listed, Sans Souci, as one of UNESCO's World Heritage, cultural heritage. Not many of us here know that that citadel, which was built by an African, King Christophe, remains not merely a tourist destination for hundreds of thousands, but indeed a source material for military architecture, mapped and studied by some of the world's experts in that field. Amateurs and professionals continue to attempt to figure out the dominant principles of that structure and its topographical relations to the peaks around La Frière, whatever that region is called. I merely point this out to show a little fraction of African history, culture, and geography that is embedded across the Atlantic. Also, it's just an excuse for me to call attention to architecture, however briefly, which I consider as one of the humanities. If others don't regard it as such, I think we on this continent, we have a duty to embrace architecture as one of the critical disciplines within African humanities. But let me get back on the track from that architectural digression. As I said, it's just an excuse to rope in architecture into this discourse. Also, to point out that the history of Abuja in the Caribbean is just a small drop in the history of the Caribbean. Nothing on the level of the heroic history of King Christophe and the others who wiped out Napoleon's army when Napoleon made the gross mistake of attempting to re-enslave people after they had been granted their freedom in the Caribbean. So he sent his troops there, but waiting for him was King Christophe's famous Comité d'accueil, which translates as committee, reception committee. It's one of the features of that architecture where if the troops entered, they found, as we say in Yoruba, iwaju òṣèlọ, ẹ̀yìn òṣè padà sí, that is, no exit, no retreat. It's one of the fascinating and I think very witty constructs of that citadel. If you have a chance, you really should go there and enjoy a slice of African history. Now, when the slaves rebelled in Jamaica, beat up their owners, downed arms, tools, they fled, naturally, as with the history of many, many zones of liberation, they fled into the mountains. So it was the first calling port, the most secure, the most defensible. And so they fled up the mountains, but they didn't just go up any mountains. They looked for some mountains which reminded them of home. And so they found this place, this scraggy rock hill in Westmoreland County, in Jamaica, which they named Abeokuta, which later became contracted over the years to Bekuta. And when I visited, I sat beside the oldest member of that settlement, a very, very old lady who was the sole survivor of the actual slaves who were taken to that part of Jamaica. She was very old, but she was the custodian, the archivist, and in fact the curator of Yoruba culture in that area. Before she died, she asked for her bed to be moved to the window so that her dying eyes would close on those rock hills, which reminded her of Oluma Rock in Abeokuta. Unfortunately, sometimes nature lends a hand also in revising in the war of attrition against historic and cultural landmarks. After a couple of floods, which inundated the settlement because they made their homes in that hill, retained the culture, the dances, even the Egungun, the masquerade festival, they performed for me, the clothing, cuisine, even some of the language. After these floods, their spirit broke and they came further down to safer territory. But they still kept vestiges of that Abeokuta village in Westmoreland. Well, nature sometimes, as I said, takes a hand in the obliteration of some of our landmarks over there, but at least nature doesn't deliberately set out to create the last man standing, which is where we find ourselves sometimes today, especially in this country, in Somalia, in swathes of the African continent, where history is not only being eliminated, but even the consumers and custodians of history, just to ensure the complete eradication, not merely of history, but of memory, are being gradually eliminated. The end of history, whether via the secular route or the theocratic route, happens to be one of the banes of human progress today. It's not new, let me stress this, to the African continent. It existed, experienced it in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge on a level which humanity has never known until then, in which the humanities were the primary target for elimination, and the scholars, the teachers, the custodians of culture and history are marched out into the fields and literally worked to death. Mira Mengistu in Ethiopia did his best to imitate, to even, if possible, exceed the excesses of Cambodia, citing, of course, the principles of collectivization, the utopia of classless society, transferring the findings of quote-unquote radical philosophies of Europe, attempting to transplant them here, eliminating and targeting savants, scholars, who still believed that humanities are in fact the ultimate recourse of human intellection, irrespective of ideology. That, what I've just uttered, would have been a blasphemy, a travesty, an act of revisionism, which would have landed me on the elimination fields, either in Cambodia or in the streets of Ethiopia. The sciences are all right. Let's always bear that in mind. The sciences are all right. Generally, they're guaranteed survival. Even the extreme fundamentalists require their services in order to be able to pirouette and advertise them to the world as killers. They need internet, they need the video. And of course, in the labor of decimation of humanity in history, they need dynamite. They need the scientists, the technologists to create suicide belts. They need technology to be able to build effective bunkers. I haven't heard of ethics or philosophy actually manufacturing bombs or bullets. It is the humanities, ultimately, therefore, that bear the brunt of the theocratic side of attenuation of humanity. Should this be surprising? No. The humanities remain the vector of ideas, and African humanities are no exception. They constitute the battleground of the mind, and the mind also happens to be where the contest for salvation or damnation is waged. In any case, as I said at the beginning, killers need technology. They do not need humanities. AK-47s must be procured and maintained at the ready. So must other assorted instruments of death. What other means enables the killer to be present in one spot at one moment and in another in a few hours? Of course, technology, the aeroplane, and yet a form of education is supposed to be anathema to these dedicated killers. And so we have a very special responsibility to the humanities for the simple reason that they are constantly disposable. We have a responsibility to re-examine even the givens of the humanity on this continent, but concentrating, focusing on the deductions for our own history, our developmental experiences, and also the vision that we envisage, that we feel is our basic just entitlement after centuries of disdain, as manifested in the phenomenon of slavery, whether towards the East or towards the West, and without any vestige, any sensibility of so-called political correctness, which sometimes enables some of our humanists to say, oh, it's all right. The enslavement by this side was not too bad, and they are closer to us, and therefore let us ignore that particular branch of the history of enslavement and concentrate on the other. That, for me, is slave talk. That, for me, is articulation of a slave mentality. When volition is denied any race, any sector of humanity, the totality of our humanity is eradicated. Half a loaf, in my view, is not better than none. So let us consider humanity in the tradition, in the metaphor of the marketplace, bearing constantly in our mind that, again, Yoruba proverb, onoko owoja, that is, it takes more than one route to enter a marketplace. It is an expression which I adopt in my approach to the humanities because it is one that saves one becoming dogmatic, intolerant, of optional ideas. In other words, treading the same route as the decimators of our own history, the traducers of our own experience, the reductionists of our humanity. Let us go haggling in that traditional but timeless space of exchange, the marketplace of African humanities. Thank you very much.